Brad Lorge, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Hey, John.
Tell me about Premonition. You started as a charity. Walk me back to the very early days of this company.
Yeah, we did start as a charity. Myself, my co-founders, Matthew and Kenneth, we're actually just finishing up our university degrees. And we found this project that we wanted to sink a little bit of time into in the food banking space. We saw that there were all of these local charities that had donations being offered to them, but logistically they just couldn't pick it up. And as we kind of dug into it deeper and deeper, the charities we were working with were saying, well, actually, if we were able to collect all the donations that were being offered to us every day, we would be able to meet all the demand we're seeing in the community. But there's a problem of logistics. And so we were pretty fresh. And we thought computers could save the world, and this looked like an opportunity for them to do so. And we got to work, and we started with the point of view that this must be a solved problem. Coordinating logistics, having all the variables of rain affecting demand and vehicle availability and real-time routing, this must exist. And at some level, it kind of did in industry, but not in an on-demand sense, or in an on-demand sense. Not in the sense of...
Okay, I'm going to pause you there because I just want to make sure I'm getting the initial founding idea correctly. So you had a food bank who had people that were desperate and needed to be fed. There was lots of food in the community. Restaurants had stuff, supermarkets, grocery stores, they all had food, but it was a matter of getting the food that was about to spoil, these restaurants and grocery stores, to the food bank. That was the problem. Exactly. The food bank didn't have a whole fleet of trucks that he'll pick up stuff on demand, and it was, how do we get the food to the food bank?
Exactly right. And the food banks had all these volunteers who would have been happy to help, but try coordinating 1,000 people every night and responding to this. This supermarket has food today, but not tomorrow. It's raining in this town, so there's more demand for food in the food banks. We need to redirect. That coordination effort was beyond the resources of the food banks we were working with. So huge issue.
And so you're thinking technology speaking, that if you could Uber the food from the supermarket to the food bank, you are effectively going to solve the problem. But Uber existed in Sydney, I understand, right? It was there at the time.
Not when we started. I actually, I think they might have had like Uber Black, and you could rent registered hire cars or something. But really, it was just starting. And I remember taking a trip to the States and seeing Uber X for the first time, and we were so excited because we thought, this like idea of computers telling people where to drive and all that, everyone's going to get it now. Like this is it being used in the wild. And before then, telling people that their mobile phone was going to be directing them to do all these logistics pickups and things like that. It just was a foreign concept to people.
Yeah. Okay, so get me back into the story. So you've got the problem is clear. How did you guys conceive a solution to it?
So at first we thought, the major logistics organizations, the kind of UPSs and DHLs of the world, or in the context of Australia, the Australia Posts, the Toll, TNT, they must have software that can do this in real time. They must have something that can do this. So we were very luckily supported by our university, the University of New South Wales, and an organization that was called NICTA at the time. It's now part of the CSIRO, which is our premier research organization. But they incubated us, put us in a space with a whole lot of top minds in optimization, and pretty quickly working with them, we came to understand that this was not a solved problem. In fact, to this day, most major logistics businesses cannot do real-time redirection of their fleet. They cannot do real-time optimization.
But the food bank doesn't have a fleet. Who's the fleet in the case of the food bank?
They've got generally a small fleet and then volunteers. And the idea was to enable someone like you and me with a bit of spare time and a car to sign on and help solve that problem for them.
Got it. And you got incubated. I was doing my research before, and I saw there was a seed round. Premonition did a seed round in 2015. I'm assuming that is this incubator that took a small piece of equity in return for their advice. Am I getting that right? Or was there something different in the way of financing?
That came a little bit after our founding. So, or at least the food bank phase. So actually, NICTA and UNSW asked for nothing. There was just blanket support for us as students and for the idea. I think people became quite passionate about it, which was fantastic. We wouldn't have gotten anywhere without kind of the kindness of strangers. And so we went through that phase, but very quickly realized that the scale of what we were attempting to do and the R&D required was not within the means of charity. The organizations we were working with couldn't fund speculative research into optimization. The universities were phenomenally supportive, but this was a serious project. And that's where we realized that really to have this vision come true, we needed to think differently. And we went after that point, and in 2015, we founded Premonition, which was a social enterprise, with the goal being that we would build the technology that we thought must have already existed, but also make it available to commercial fleets, but also make it available at no cost to not-for-profits.
Interesting. So where does it go from there? You've got this business now started. How did you get it financed?
So the the very start involved a few days where we found this anchor customer who we'd met in the food banking world. They were a commercial fleet that'd been supporting Food Bank, and they said they'd love to have the technology enabled for their fleet. It was a business called Crossmark. And so, they knew we were pretty fresh, and they agreed to an initial deposit, which is about $250,000, which for us as students was like, oh, wow, that's amazing. We've made it. But I remember we had to put our business number into the contract that Crossmark was going to sign. And we went to our accountants and we said, look, we need this business number. And they said, well, it's going to be, $15,000, $20,000 to found it and set up all the structures and things like that. And we didn't have that money. So we said, could you give us 7 days? And they said, yes. So we founded it. We hand wrote the business number into the contract. We signed, we got the deposit check, and we paid with a day to spare. And Premonition was off.
Wow. What a great story. And so I want to be clear as to what Premonition offered back in those days. So when you say you had this company Crossmark with a fleet, they wanted to optimize that fleet. So they wanted to optimize the volume of deliveries it could do based on the number of delivery vehicles it had, maximize effectively the efficiency of that fleet. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. You're always looking in optimization. You're always looking to balance things. You're looking to balance efficiency with robustness, customer service and ability to respond with total cost. You're looking at driver fairness. That's something we learned a lot about, where you want to make sure, depending on how you pay your drivers, that everyone's getting paid fairly and getting a fair opportunity to work, even if it's not the total maximum, most efficient thing. So there's a lot of real-world problems and very nuanced interacting problems that come into optimization. And so was this a custom piece of software just for Crossmark? Like, were you developing a custom optimization? Like, were you effectively a consulting company at this point? There were moments in the business's history where we were close, we were doing consulting type work, but not this one. The optimizer we built for Crossmark was in the image of what we thought needed to exist for the rest of the industry. And so that became the core IP. Call it version 1. There's a version 2 and a version 3 that have existed. But that really is the kind of predecessor to the optimizer we sell today as a SaaS platform. And did you have the foresight at the time to negotiate the IP rights so that Crossmark didn't claim that they owned it based on the original $250K deposit? Like, did you think all that stuff through? I mean, you guys were young. I imagine that was probably new information. Yeah, a lot of it was new. we had a really great coach, Frank, from UNSW, who was part of their IP team. And we had a family lawyer, a guy named Lyle, who's just been amazing and was with us on the whole journey. And they sat us down and read us the riot act on making sure that we negotiated that. And thank goodness they did, because since then we've obviously learned how to structure deals. But at the time, anything could have happened there.
Got it. I have to ask, before we move to present day, did you ever deploy the software for the food bank?
Yeah, so we worked with Food Bank Australia on their COVID response in the end. That's when the software was ready and they were ready. It was a phenomenal project that got meals to frontline workers, nurses, firefighters, things like that, during those early and pretty scary days of COVID. We also ended up working with a great group called the Bread and Butter Project. And they distribute baked goods all across Sydney and increasingly across Australia. And they've provide an opportunity to train bakers from disadvantaged backgrounds, and they put all the profits into community development. So an amazing organization. We'd always love to do more in the not-for-profit space. And if any of the listeners are connected to a great charity, reach out.
Is this philanthropic bent something you and Matthew and Kenneth, your co-founding team, all share a passion for? Or are you more the sort of leader in this vein?
No, look, I think that's definitely a value we all share. And in fact, I think the core team, most of our team, I think the average tenure now is 7 years, and we've all 6.5, and we've only been around for about 8. The core team that came around this business came around it for value first, profit second. That helped us. That helped us a lot over the course of the business. I think everyone entered with the idea of the purpose of what we were doing first, and when we hit really rough times, that kind of steered us through. So I wish I could claim that, but I can't. That's a whole team effort.
You mentioned rough times. What was you were in business for 6 years before the Shipit acquisition. What was the low point? Like, what was the near death experience? Describe what the lowest point was in the business journey.
Look, we had a few. Fundamentally, our business is enterprise SaaS, and in hindsight, don't do that. That's a difficult business model.
Why do you say that?
Enterprise SaaS, particularly in a region like Australia, is really challenging because the sales cycles are extraordinarily long. The deal complexity is really high. You end up with a lot of bespoke requirements on every deal. Even today, we're down to 10% bespoke rather than 70% bespoke, which is where we started. So that's really hard. And your addressable market is limited in a region like Australia. So put those factors together, and it also makes funding challenging because there are not many VC funds in the region which specialize in enterprise SaaS. And we're talking about kind of the minimum deal size of about $1 million a year. So that's where we've grown to. We didn't start there, but that's eventually where we found our sweet spot. So it's a very hard business, very slow deal cycle, and you're very exposed to individual customers, particularly when you're kind of looking to show growth every year. So we had a low point. I think I don't remember what year it was, but we had a really long-running implementation with a key customer, and I don't think we had handled it as well as I would like to have now, looking back and knowing the things I know. I think that customer also was going through a lot of change internally and had a lot of things on the go that made it difficult for them to implement the system. But there came a point where it looked like the whole project was going to fail and they were going to churn. And as we ran the numbers and as we looked at what was in the pipeline, it very much would have meant layoffs in the team, a significant reset of our growth trajectory, and it meant failure on something that a team had been working on for over a year, and it's a small team that are purpose driven. So failure hurts a lot. So that almost killed us. And
how big were you at the time? Like what kind of turnover did you have? How many employees, that kind of stuff?
So we were sitting at about 1.8 ARR at that point, roughly, and sitting at about 18 heads.
18 people.
Yep.
Got it. Okay. So about $100,000 per employee, and burning cash at that point, I'd imagine.
Yeah. Burning a bit of cash. So we were largely bootstrapped, but we had a little bit of angel funding and some strategic investors that came in to support us through that phase.
Yeah. How much equity did you have to give up to the angels and the strategic equity guys to get through to the exit?
So we ended up giving away about 20% of the business.
And in retrospect, would you change anything about the way you financed the journey? I realized hindsight's 2020, and it's always easy to kind of look back and go, "Oh, we shouldn't have given money here. We should have." But for the listeners who are thinking of maybe raising some money to get them to the vision, I'd just be curious if there's anything you would do differently, or maybe have a do-over if you could change anything about the way you financed it.
Yeah. So I think one of at the end of the day, 20% is a big chunk of the business, but I think, in the context of VC funded businesses, I think we did all right there. Part of how we got through to that point is we often negotiated prepayments from our key customers. And, we explain the phase of business we were in, explain, very transparently that, we are growing and funding's needed. And we'd say, look, if you're able to prepay a year or a year and a half of your license fees, we can give that back to you in benefits, but you're also helping us grow the company, and you're investing in our ability to deliver you a good product. Now, it's a little bit risky, and you really have to have a lot of trust with yourselves and the customers you go and approach in that way. But we did that a couple times, and that allowed us to extend our runway much further than and retain more equity than we would have been able to if we hadn't negotiated those deals. So I thought,
what was the most challenging rebuttal you heard to that pitch when you're talking to customers and saying, "Hey, if you can prepay, that'll help finance it, and we're good guys here in Sydney and helping the world." And like, what was the toughest negotiating response to that you heard?
Yeah.
And how did you overcome it?
So there was kind of two. One was, hang on, guys, you're not going to be solvent if we go with you, and fair enough. Like you're really you're being quite vulnerable in that moment when you go through, and then you definitely need to be able to turn up with your forecasts and your P&L and your balance sheet and just allay everyone's fears, because that's the last thing you want in one of these deals, is a concern that you're just going to be one of those 90% of startups that don't make it. So you're trying to build confidence while asking for a prepayment. Luckily, we were generally able to navigate that through transparency. The other one, I think, was probably actually a more important one in hindsight that I didn't really understand at the time. But we would sometimes get a customer saying, "Well, if we prepay, how do we keep you accountable?" And it's amazing how much trouble it can cause in a deal if a customer doesn't feel like they can hold you accountable. I think whenever, every project hits trouble. You're trying to do anything big, it's difficult. When those moments hit, a customer needs to trust you as the provider. They need to trust you as individuals, that you're going to work with integrity and be honest with them. But they also need to trust that they've got recourse. And if you don't allow for that recourse to exist in a meaningful way, then you end up seeing behaviors that are not super helpful in stressful moments. So that, I think that is actually the other side, is just making sure that you are willing to be held accountable and give your customers recourse if something's not successful. Because if you don't...
And how did you do that in this case?
So we didn't do it well initially. And then we hit problems, and then we had customers that were very concerned, and we ended up just having to really lean on, personal trust, and demonstrating goodwill. But I think we could have avoided a lot of trouble if we had put in penalty clauses that did something like extend how much credit they had, or potentially even offer part equity in the business in the event that we hadn't met our commitments. Now, some risk there, and to be honest, there's probably some factors I'd need to think through in terms of mechanically if that would even be valuable, or if that would be scary for a customer to end up owning a piece of something that had just failed. But I think we didn't do it well. I would endeavor to find a way to ensure the customer had recourse if I tried to do a prepayment style structure again.
Mm. At $1.8 million in ARR and 18 employees, are you starting to, along with Matt and Ken, think about the value of the company? I mean, you must be if you're raising money. Have you got a sense at this point of what a company like yours is worth on the open market? Are you using any benchmarks or?
No, not at that time. We actually had a few approaches from pretty serious international competitors of the business. Early days. And this was during the period of buzz of, Uber's going to dominate every logistics player. Amazon's coming knocking. Who knows what Google's going to do next? So there was a lot of uncertainty with regards to how these kind of disruptive players were going to impact the transport space. So that's why I think, we got a lot of early interest and some pretty high numbers kind of being thrown around. But we knew
when you say pretty high numbers, like what like multiples of revenue, like what kind of multiples of revenue would they have been at that time?
In those days, and we never went far enough to firm these numbers, but it's pretty common to see a kind of a 12x or a 13, 14x being thrown as an opening gambit. We didn't take them too seriously, and just for the fact that we knew there was so much more of our kind of vision we hadn't built yet, and we saw a huge amount of opportunity in the space.
Yeah, to be clear, it's just for my listeners, you're talking about 12, 13, 14 times revenue, correct?
That's right, yeah. Well, of ARR.
Got it. Yeah. ARR, excuse me, yeah. ARR, again, stands for annual recurring revenue. And if folks listening are wondering, wow, I wonder if I can get that kind of multiple for my business, remember, this is a SaaS company, software as a service company, and they generally trade at astronomical multiples, or have done until recent past.
That's right.
And so keep that in mind. A little warning on the back of the tin.
And yeah, there was a golden era, and I'm not convinced we're in it anymore.
Yeah. Why do you say that?
I think multiples are. So I think generally, I mean, I'm sure you've discussed the macro trends, and there's probably people more qualified to comment on it. I also think that the uncertainty of the disruptive players has abated a little bit. I think when Uber was first rocketing through, Amazon was entering our market, and we were seeing kind of these astronomical growth of businesses like WiseTech. It was a phenomenal business, but it created a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the rest of the market. And in times of uncertainty, anything that looks like it's going to contribute to an answer to this incoming threat will be of more strategic value. But as time passes and people become more familiar and they understand where they'll win and where they'll lose against those disruptive players, well, then it's not as strategically valuable to bring in a startup that has some promising technology and a little bit of growth. So I think the two factors really compound to create the conditions we're seeing today.
Yeah. So let's get back to the story. So we're at $1.8 million in ARR, annual recurring revenue. You raise some money, give up a little slice of equity to fund the growth. How then big did you get the business before you decided to sell it? I guess big, I'm looking for, like, what was the ARR when you decided to sell?
Yeah. So the annual contract value, which is, all of our contracts running for a full calendar year, was a bit north of $3 million.
Got it. And for folks who may not know, including myself, the difference between annual recurring revenue and annual contract value, can you just distinguish between the two?
Yeah. So with annual recurring revenue, you're looking at what you're actually banking now. But with we sometimes look at ACV and annual contract value in enterprise deals, because you might have a deal that is rolling out, so it's not at its full monthly billing yet. But as that account hits their full billing number, their contract value, then you've got a new ARR. So ARR lags annual contract value.
Got it. Trailing 12-month TTM, trailing 12-month ARR will be a historical measure, and whereas contract value is a forward-looking measure.
Normally,
to some extent,
you're looking at about 3 to 6 months forward measure, but not but different to just our projected growth. It's signed contracts that are in the process of rolling out. Yeah. That's helpful. And did you also have any services revenue? Like, did you charge for implementation, or was that all baked into the contracts? Yeah, talking about being green, we didn't know to do that initially, because we'd always been consumers and interacted with consumer SaaS, and so it just didn't occur to us that we should be charging for that. And again, talking about accountability. Like, if you're not charging for those services, which are pretty immense in the initial phase of a project, then how does someone not pay you if you haven't done the right work? So, so we've started to do that. That only ended up making up about 10% of our revenue. Got it. But it's a significant amount of the energy of the business was in services.
I'd imagine. But once you get one of these implementations in successfully, I can imagine these customers are sticky, really sticky. Like, what was your annual churn rate, revenue or logo churn rate, whatever you were reporting? No. You're shaking your head on. If you're watching on YouTube, you're like, in other words, none.
Yeah, we certainly lost accounts, but never once they went live.
Wow.
It's and for context, the systems we were replacing, if they weren't made of paper, they were older than I am. So it's a very sticky, customer base. Our kind of gross margin, so kind of our revenue minus the direct costs into providing the software, was over 80%. But then we still ran a loss because we were investing in the R&D and the general business. So we never turned a profit.
And you had, I think I read somewhere you had 21 employees at this stage of the game.
Yeah. So we had kind of 25 people, but 21 full-time equivalents.
Yeah. And I'd imagine some of those employees are fairly expensive, data modelers and analytics people, and obviously coders and so forth.
Yeah, it's a complex kind of problem to tackle. Again, something of a learning in there. I think we were a group of engineers, so we went for the hardest engineering problem. And that was expensive and slow. We also had phenomenal people ops capability. I think something I'm really proud of. Amanda Smith was our head of people ops and just did a phenomenal job promoting an engaged and transparent culture within the business and supporting individuals. We had a gentleman named Trevor Goodman, who's was previously a VP at DHL and stepped in to run our finances on a part-time basis, but really helped us grow the business. So really phenomenal.
Amazing. So you're $3 million in ARR, or excuse me, annual contract value, ACV, 25 people. I'd imagine you're burning some cash still. And the reason I'm asking this is I'm trying to get a sense of what triggered the sale. I'm imagining if I'm reading between the lines, and again, you tell me where I'm getting it wrong, but at that stage, you're probably at a bit of an inflection point. Like, we've either got to go raise more money or sell. Am I getting that right? Were you at that sort of fork in the road? Or
yeah, that's exactly it. So we'd had some experimentation with selling into Europe. We actually had a guy named 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙍, who was on the ground there, and just a phenomenal, well-connected, brilliant guy, like the ideal person to have as your kind of lone ranger in a new region. And, brought great opportunities with national postal organizations to us. We're having conversations once a week with senior people, but they all wanted a presence on the ground, and we couldn't fund that. But we also knew that the Australian market for logistics is limited and it's slow, and we weren't going to be able to sustain our growth rate if we didn't raise the capital and make the investments needed to grow the business. And so really we looked at fundraising. We spoke to some of the Australian venture capital funders, spoke to a little bit of private equity. There was some interest, but I think enterprise SaaS was not in anybody's portfolio mandate. We looked different to a marketplace or a consumer SaaS product, or even a B2B kind of SaaS product, as distinguished from the B2E, which is what we were, enterprise sales. So as we stared into each of those pieces, we slowly landed on a belief that either merging with another business or being acquired by a business was the best path for our shareholders to get some value in the short term, but really to see the business succeed in the way we believed it could.
And take me inside the boardroom or the pub, or where you and Matt and Ken had that conversation.
Yeah.
Was everybody unanimous? Was there sort of a view among some people that, hey, we should continue to go it alone, or was everybody landed at the same spot?
We didn't have a blue over it, or we didn't. There wasn't conflict. No.
What did you say? Aussies have the best expressions. You didn't have a blue over it?
We didn't have a blue. That means
what does that mean?
It's a good question. Well, look, no one shouted.
Okay.
I think the path became clear to us all at a similar time as we were reporting back on the feedback we were getting from the VC space, but also we had known for a long time that we were limited. We knew we could capture more of the market with the right investment, and we'd known that for some time. We were having to turn opportunities away. We ended up turning off our marketing because we were saturated, but we kind of had this chicken and egg problem where we needed to invest to hit the next level of scale, and so we were all on the same page. We had a great board. At this point, I had a co-CEO, TNT Mac, who was actually the former chief technology officer from Australia Post, the biggest logistics players in Australia. I think we over a few, call it 3 different meetings, explored the options, decided it was worth investigating merger or acquisition. And then by the 3rd meeting, I think everyone was aligned that this was worth pursuing. And so we kicked off that process.
And what was that like? Tell me about the first step proactively you took to market the business for sale.
Yeah. So now, mind you, this is during COVID and no one was allowed out of their houses. And Australia had a pretty different COVID, I think, to the rest of the world. So we
try living in Toronto, Canada. I'm sure we trump you in terms of lockdown longevity and rigor. But anyways, we'll have that debate at another time.
Yeah. It was an interesting time to be doing something that requires a lot of face-to-face conversations normally and a lot of trust.
I bet.
So we, the first thing we did was look at all of the businesses in our space that were doing well, but also were in a similar position, weren't quite hitting that kind of inflection point of growth, but had all the potential there. And we ended up, Australia is actually a pretty small place. So we spoke to the founders of a few really, really great businesses that we had a thesis that said if we put these 2 businesses together and we streamline what they're focused on, then there's an opportunity to break out of Australia or really capture a very valuable part of this market.
Was it the same thesis for all of the companies you explored?
No, we had slightly different approaches. We had one firm that had a really strong presence in what we would call kind of merchant services. So they work with retailers directly, whereas we work more with the logistics providers directly. And they saw an opportunity to kind of offer a one-stop shop to these retailers for their own fleets, for outsourced service providers, for click and collect, and all kinds of interesting things there. So that firm was very much us offering something very new to the merchant world. Another firm was more traditionally in our space, and they were what you would call a transport management system. So they were connected with all the big shipping companies who are sending containers, not parcels, and they drop them into a country somewhere in the world, and they'd need to get what was in that container to the recipient, and sometimes break that down into parcels and send it. And so a much more traditional business software play, much less disruptive, but certainly more aligned to where we were. And there were a few others that, but those ended up becoming front runners for us outside of Shipit, who ended up acquiring us.
Yeah, I want to get to Shipit in a minute, but how many companies, because I think our listeners would really benefit from understanding how to identify the strategic acquirers, potential strategic acquirers for a company. And you've done a great job of illustrating two theses, both different reasons to buy your business, but both strategic for their own reason. How many strategic companies did you have on your short list of where you thought there was a real, strategic fit?
So we started with a list of about 20 that were credible in our eyes. You get the list of 1,000 firms in the sector, and everyone writes down every business they know, and you look at all of them. But we came to about 20 that were credible, and then we started to have conversations with those businesses and identify if there was appetite, if there was capacity.
And how did you develop the list of 20? Again, did you outsource that to an M&A firm, a consulting firm, or did you and Matt and Ken and T develop the list of 20 yourselves?
Yeah, the internal team developed that list with the support of our board, with our kind of core team. We had a director of customer, Nicholas, who was phenomenally helpful in that effort as well. And between us, we sifted through the list and identified, kind of from our point of view, the 20 that we could create a credible story about the strategic fit.
And are you telling your people, I keep rattling around in the back of my mind is just your retention rate of your people, the fact that you're a purpose-driven organization, that it's not just you who has this philanthropic bent, it's the entire team. And so I'm in my mind going, how is this guy managing this with his people, of which he's got 25? Because the classic sort of rule of thumb is don't tell your people anything, right? And I'm imagining if you're involving Nicholas in the discussion, maybe Amanda, others, you're having to let them in on the secret a little bit. What have you told your team at this point?
Yeah. I remember having those chats with some advisors I had, and the classic advice, and I think there's real truth to it, don't distract your people with another kind of front to worry about. You've got already a hard enough job as a member of a small team like this. Do you really need to be going through the ups and downs of fundraising? But in our case, we chose, I think, a reasonably high degree of transparency. We took the view that our guys are just, too aware. I think they can read our faces particularly well, and trying to hide something like that or operate in secret, I think, was always just going to create angst and doubt about the future of the business and how well they would be engaged and consulted in any decision. So we took the view that with all the risks of distraction, it was better to be clear with everyone about what we were attempting to do, how it was going, how uncertain we were or confident we were at any point in time. But we wouldn't necessarily go through the finer details of exactly who we were talking to or exactly what the deal roadblocks were. We would just give a general sentiment.
How did you characterize it to your team? Because I think if you plotted the potential responses or positioning, I should say, on one side of the equation, you've got, look, Matt and Ken and I are going shopping for the highest bidder. We've got one foot in Tahiti. We're heading to the beach, and you guys are going to be left holding the bag. I'm guessing that's not the way you characterize it. Whereas the other end of the spectrum is, hey, it's natural for a business to, as it reaches these sort of stages of growth, to look for outside funding at times. And so we're going through a phase where we're looking at maybe bringing on some extra investors, which sounds very benign, but is not necessarily the most truthful response that you could give. So where did you land on that spectrum?
Yeah. So we landed on, and I have to credit T's leadership as well through this period. I think he was a very steady hand in this conversation. The whole team knew we needed funding to grow. It was apparent to everyone in every function that they were getting stretched, and that they could all see we were losing opportunities as a result of that. So there was no surprise when we went to them and said, look, guys, we've had a very, very, a very solid run at identifying the best way for us to secure that funding, secure the growth of the business and the capacity for us to actually deliver on the mission that everyone signed up for. And as a result, we're going down the path of identifying potential mergers or an acquirer for the business. And there was a lot of uncertainty that created and a lot of questions, but we at that point could start meeting up again. And we did a lot, and again, T's leadership, Amanda's leadership, my whole leadership team, including my co-founders, were very good about letting difficult questions be asked in public, and allowing for kind of answers to sink in over time and to just be consistent and be aligned in our position as to why we thought this was the best for our people, best for our customers, and best for our product.
And did the people share in any sort of economic upside to a sale? Like, did they have stock options? Obviously, I'm sure T did, but did the sort of rank and file employee have some sort of stock options or phantom equity or something that would be financially rewarding for them if there was an acquisition? Yeah.
So, we might have been green when we started this thing and we made plenty of mistakes. The one thing I think we got right is, from the day the business was founded, 10% of the company was set aside as a pool for employees, and we ended up growing that a little bit. So we would kind of take the view that we only wanted to work with co-owners. We weren't interested in people kind of turning up for just a consulting gig or something like that. We wanted a bunch of co-owners making decisions together in the business.
When you've got 10 employees and you've got 10%, it's easy to give everybody a percentage of the business. How do you manage that as you grow? Because effectively, if the nut is 10%, and I acknowledge that it grew a little bit over time, the more people you add, the more diluted the previous shareholders become. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with that dilution with employees who I'm assuming aren't necessarily, finance experts, probably don't understand some of the nuances of it? Like, how did you choose to sort of help educate them about what it meant that you were bringing on a team member, that the pool wasn't growing commensurate with the new team member, that you would actually be diluted? Yeah.
So with the way we set up that particular program, and there were mistakes in that program that administratively, still cause headaches. But the system worked on it effectively was designed to last 5 years. and then we topped it up. And really, it weighted the early contributions a little bit higher and the later contributions a little bit lower, with the theory being the business will be worth more and be more stable, and risk is reduced there. So, the staff who really took the risk and went through the kind of the hardest periods of the business ended up with a bit more proportionately of a chunk than a new employee would get. This is always a difficult thing, as with any sort of RAM or comp or anything in a small business. I mean, it is always fraught. So I think it's as much as you can rely on rules and as much as you can act consistently over time, the less conflict you're going to get. I don't think you can avoid it completely. I think there's always going to be a moment where something potentially is unfair and it happens, and someone gets more than reasonably they should have. And in that moment, I'd favour just consistency and structure as much as possible, rather than trying to intervene in every single kind of problem that comes up, because on average the system was designed well and worked well and rewarded people well.
Yeah. Got it. So let's get back. So you've got these 20 credible strategic fit companies that the internal team has identified. Where does it go from there?
So we divvied them up. We said who's got relationships, and we also have the cold call list, and we started having conversations. So we'd either talk to contacts we knew, or we'd reach straight through to a corporate dev team, or we would go to a partner manager and have a conversation about where we were at. Pretty quickly, that list starts to shrink. Some acquirers were reeling from potential acquirers or potential merger targets were reeling from COVID. Some were getting unbelievably boosted by COVID in a way that wasn't going to be sustainable, and they just they weren't going to credibly be a long-term home for us. And others, just looked at the business and looked at where they were and what they're acquiring and said, guys, it's probably not right for us at this stage. And so
how did you approach them? Like, what were the words you used? Did you use words like, we're looking at maybe building a strategic partnership or a partnership? Did you use the words merger? Be curious to know what words you used in the email to approach these guys.
Yeah. So where we had an existing relationship, I think the conversation looked something like, look, we're looking at our long-term growth and wanted to see if there might be some strategic advantage to looking at our businesses in concert, or having a conversation about whether or not there might be a fit between our two businesses, and we might be able to put a stronger offer to market by collaborating or partnering or potentially merging. And we'd always kind of list the options out. For the bigger players, it certainly starts with a conversation about partnership, because that's really where you can have the full conversation about the strategic value of the businesses, and then you would tend to then pivot from there and say, well, look, if we could be so strategically advantageous for your customers, would you be interested in potentially taking a stake or looking at some sort of acquisition to support this partnership? And so you get through those conversations pretty quickly, and we were down to kind of a short list of kind of 3 really interesting options, which Shipit wasn't on, by the way. And then we had kind of 2 to 3 that were possible, but down our preference list.
So you've got 3 options, 3 solid options, 3 compelling options. Have you gotten to the stage at this point where they put together some preliminary numbers in the form of a letter of intent, or have you started to talk about value or deal structure yet at this point?
Yeah, so we got with 2 of the 3, we got to the point of discussing deal structure, running models, looking at, in the case of merger, relative ownership and relative valuations of the business. In the case of acquisition, multiples on revenue and kind of the
And so what multiples
because,
are you hearing at this point, Brett? Like, what, are
well,
you back in this 12 and 14 times revenue number, or what are you hearing?
so we weren't hearing that back then, and I have to say, I wouldn't venture to guess what the numbers are like now. I think the market's still all over the shop. There's still good deals happening, but the vast majority of what I've been seeing is dramatic reductions from 10x. Like then I think, we were sitting at about a 7x when we exited. Just about. But and I think that was middle of the road for that time. I think it's lower now, and I think if we were trying to sell or raise today, and I think I'm sure it'll get better soon, but I don't think we'd see that multiple, just based on the businesses I've seen.
Yeah, the three options that you're looking at are around the 7x number at this point.
Yeah,
plus or minus.
Yeah, we were all of them were within a reasonable band there.
Yeah, and are you driving that? Are you sort of saying, look, guys, for us to do a deal, we sort of need to see a 7, or were they like? It's surprising that all three would triangulate around the same number if there wasn't some influence from you. Did you sort of tip your hat as to what you were expecting at all?
Yeah, we walked in with a benchmark study that someone had done that showed that we should be getting an 11x. We ran all of those numbers through and put it on the table, and not everyone took that too seriously. I think in reality, we knew the range at which our board would be comfortable approving a deal, and we knew the range in which we thought it would be fair value for our shareholders and for our acquirer as well. We didn't want to put a deal through that, I guess, didn't deliver value in the long term for an acquirer.
I get that, and I'm wondering, when you sell a home, there's a school of thought that says never tell your real estate agent what you'll accept, because miraculously they somehow, although they say they never do, kind of tip the buyer to that. They got to get to at least this number, and they sort of tip the hat. Did you sort of? I guess where I'm going with this is, did you and your board and everybody felt like 7's fair, but did you sort of share that with the potential acquirers either overtly, or did you intimate it in some level?
I'm sure they could pick up that that's where our comfort zone was, but it was never our strategy to walk out and say, here's our number. But
they kind of might have guessed a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. And look, the other piece to look at is it certainly was the case that there were quite a few Australian-centric benchmarking studies that sat businesses of our profile between 6 and 8 over that period, and so we're in a very narrow band there that would be supporting the valuation that that would be supporting what the advisors of our acquirers would be saying to them.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you've got these three, you've got fair, sounds like, offers on the table. Where does it go from there? Because at some point, Shipit hasn't even reared its head yet. So where does this take us? Tell us the Shipit story.
Yeah, so I've known Will, one of the co-CEOs of Shipit, for a long time, and really respected them. We played in different spaces, but within logistics, but we were both in logistics, in tech.
Explain what Shipit does for folks who've never heard of them.
So Shipit's a phenomenal business and product for merchants selling online or merchants that need to ship their products to their consumers. They allow you to create a multi-carrier delivery network. So you can take the best express product from one company and the best on-demand product from another. You can look at having, they've got a product called Smart Routing, which is kind of like WebJet, but for carriers, where you've got multiple different carriers stuck together. So they really provide a very advanced offering, but focused on e-commerce merchants, on traditional merchants sending things, creating that great customer experience and that consistent customer experience for consumers, but they didn't do a lot of work with the carriers themselves. And so that's really where we called it the Trinity, the kind of the consumer, the merchant, and the carrier. And our old logo was the Trinity mark. But they really nailed merchant and consumer, and we were the preeminent system for carriers.
Excellent. And so you mentioned you'd known the founder of Shipit for a period?
Yeah, so I'd known Will, one of the two co-founders, for a long time, and had a huge amount of respect for him personally as well as the business. I had known some of their staff. Their chief of staff was an old friend. And so, funnily enough, when we approached them, it wasn't a conversation about acquisition. We knew they'd done well. We knew they'd just secured one round, and they were about to secure another, which has now been announced. But we wanted to work with them as a customer of ours. We thought that some of the things they were working on were quite exciting, and I said, to Will, look, if you're building some of the stuff I think you're building, we'd love to be involved. And Will turned around and said, well, would you be open to acquisition? And that was a complete surprise to me on the call. It was just good timing, and like all, I think, good deals, there was just a natural strategic fit, and no one really went looking for it. It just became suddenly obvious to everyone on the call and subsequently in the meetings that followed. So that's how it happened.
Wow. And so how did you handle that bombshell? Because you were down the road fairly significantly with these three other firms. Fill us in. What happens next? Did you say, well, Will, we gotta move fast because we've got three other deals on the table here?
Yeah. John, that was hard. We spent a lot of time as a board talking about how we do right by everyone in this process. We said,
God, you're so nice. Makes me crazy.
No, look, I had a board and co-founders that valued integrity immensely. So that was just, that's how it was done. And we didn't want to, especially when we were talking about strategic mergers with other startups in a similar place to us, we never wanted to put them in a position that could compromise their businesses. That's other business owners. So as much as we did owe our shareholders the best possible return, I think we secured that. Wherever we could, we wanted to make sure we didn't do damage to other businesses.
Okay, so practically though, what did you do? Because Will has kind of dropped this bombshell, but there are these three other offers. So practically, what did you say to him?
So we said, look, we are interested and we are in the market, but we need to move quickly. We're pretty far down the road on some other options. So we would need to know, within, the next 2 to 3 weeks, what a deal could look like. And to their credit, they swung into action. So Shipit had just brought on board a guy named Chris Weaver, who I ended up working very closely with for a long period of time. And he is a really experienced hand when it comes to M&A. And I think that enabled the deal to happen. Chris had previously worked for WiseTech. He'd worked for 𝙎𝙬𝙊𝙀 in the M&A space. And he shot straight. He was very good at guiding us through the process that he wanted to run, and very transparent about each of the steps. So I think that enabled us to move quickly. Him and I were able to establish trust quite quickly, and we got to the point where they put an offer forward that was compelling. And
what made it compelling?
So in terms of the total figures, it wasn't radically different from the other deals. But in all the deals, there was a component of the sale which included shares in the acquiring business. So no deal was there was one deal that was all cash, but that was a lot lower than we thought was the reasonable value for the business. we believed in the Shipit growth story the most. And so from that perspective, we thought that it would be in the best interest of our customers, who showed a lot of faith in supporting our business over the years, and we wanted to repay. Chris and I had sat down at one point and we ran through comparatively the Premonition values and the Shipit values, and we talked a lot about how we got stuff done. And from that conversation, T and I were comfortable it was the best fit for our people. And from a product perspective, I think their product and our product had the most natural synergy, if you want to call it that. We could deliver a lot of value to the merchants they served, but likewise, we could help carriers surface information or introduce new products for those merchants in a way that would be really hard to do if the two businesses weren't tightly coupled. So
was Shipit sort of in the 7x revenue valuation range like you guys?
No, they were a bit higher. Just trying to remember the exact number, but they eked past 10 during that period.
Why were they worth more?
They had
on a dollar for dollar basis.
They had just an incredible surge of growth through COVID. Just an incredible year-on-year growth.
And if you think about the four firms, and again, if I'm getting into territory you can't really speak to, I totally appreciate that. But could you just, for our listeners, I think they would benefit from hearing the proportion of equity they would likely need to roll over. So you mentioned each of the deals, these three that were valuing you guys in this kind of 7 times ARR or ACV, you were going to have to roll some equity. Like, give me, is it 10%? Is it 50%? Like, ballpark, what were they sort of looking for?
Look, I can't speak to the general case, but in our case, the ranges were between 50 and 75%. So, the kind of, the most kind of cash heavy deal was 50% of the total value of the business.
Interesting. Okay. So you've got to feel super confident that equity you're rolling is going to be worth something one day.
That's right. And so
that's a big nut.
So the easiest one, and one of the firms in the mix, is if a business is listed on the stock exchange. If you've got a listed business, then those shares, depending on the terms of the deal, can be fairly liquid. But Shipit's not listed. Shipit's a private business. And so it's, reduced liquidity. So yeah, we had to believe in it. And there were long discussions, I think the board playing their role in challenging that belief. But in the end, I think everyone was and is very confident that Shipit's was the right long-term source of value for our shareholders.
And we're getting into the weeds a little bit, but were the investors that you had, did they have the same class of shares that you had, or did they have preferred stock that would entitle them to get liquid at this stage, or did they have to roll as well?
Yeah, so we had a single share class across all shareholders, which is tricky, and I think increasingly it's becoming rare. But I think in moments like this, it puts everyone, I think, in the right headspace to look at maximizing total value rather than, I guess the kind of games that sometimes come up when you've got preferred shareholders on a cap table.
How do you get comfortable? And again, I think rolling equity, in particular in this environment, is very, very common. And so I think a lot of our listeners will have to reconcile the fact that part of their value will be in equity in the acquiring company. And at the same time, I think some people look at that as just tremendous risk, because they go from owning a business that they fully control, that they've got the yoke and they can decide, where to fly the plane, to a situation where they're a minority shareholder in a private company that they don't control, and they are very squeamish about that. So how did you, I'm sure you felt some of the same emotions. How did you overcome that trepidation from going from majority control, driving the bus, to maybe walk us through your thinking there?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And yeah, I've already shared that we went through a process of really at length assessing which option we believed in the most, and we'll, there's the belief, that sounds great, and then there's the, what supporting evidence do we have to build confidence in our beliefs, and we went through that. But fundamentally, I think there's another point that you're kind of digging into there, which is there's like, I'll call it the ego component. If you have founded a business and you have been steering the ship, it is very hard to conceive of becoming a minority shareholder, and it is hard. I think for me, there was a transition in my thinking that had happened a couple of years before this. And really with bringing T on, I think was the ultimate kind of step in that process to stop seeing the business as kind of a deeply integrated part of my personality, which in retrospect it was, to an asset and a business that I had a job in. And I had a specific job, which was to look after my shareholders and my people. And I had gone through a lot of kind of personal mentality shifting over that period. So when it came to this decision, it was easier. But had the same scenario happened a couple of years earlier, I think I would have found it immensely difficult to kind of.
How did you, thank you for sharing that, because Brad, I think that is a really incredible insight. For folks who are about to go through this process of starting to separate their own, call it ego, for lack of better words, their status as the owner or control of the business to that of an employee of a business that they happen to have some shares in it. Were there books that you read or courses or mentors that you leaned on? Like what was your journey like? How did you come to that separation effectively?
Yeah, I wish there was a book I'd read, and if you have one you recommend, I'd love to read it, because I think it was a big moment in kind of my personal journey as a founder. I think fundamentally it came from the understanding that I needed to shift my thinking came from my advisors. I had an incredible group of advisors who all had decades of experience and achieved great things themselves and were very, very kind with their time. And I, at some point, we were having a rough period in the business where everything was harder than it should have been, and we're having risk of losing a key person because we'd messed something up that we shouldn't have, and a customer was finding that we weren't delivering for them, and it was a really hard period. And I think a few advisors at the same time turned around and said, look, this business will run better if you can separate your ego from your role, and you need to spend some time doing that. And I was like, okay. First of all, I didn't know what they were talking about, and then eventually with repetition, I kind of got it. I saw me reacting to things not in a thoughtful way as a leader, but actually as kind of someone who is a little bit too wrapped up in the success of the business and feeling anxious whenever a hard decision had to be made. And so I finally agreed that maybe they had a point, and then started working with them on how they would view situations, and started to be a lot more consultative in before I reacted to or made a decision or determined how I felt about a big thing. I just run it past one or two of the advisors, and pretty quickly I think I started to see that separate owner from operator kind of mentality start to build. I think anything you can read on servant leadership was immensely helpful over that period in giving me a framework for what good leadership does look like. And I think I really spent a bit of time staring into what I was doing that matched that and what I was doing that didn't match the servant leadership model. And turns out there was a fair bit, and I appreciate the patience of everyone I worked with. And so really that was my personal leadership journey. It just so happened that made it a lot easier to, see, the sale of the business is not me handing over control, but really, I saw it as me doing my job. It was my role to make sure the business was successful. And, we'd gone through a long process to determine that this is what we believed would make the business most successful.
How did you approach, you start to work with Will's colleague, Chris Weaver at Shipit, and you work through the 2-week period that they needed to develop to get their offer in place. They brought you an offer that was similar to what you received from the others. How did you then approach it with the other three? Like, did a lot of founders in your spot, I think, would have said, okay, well, let's have a bake-off and let's try to gin this offer up, play one off the other, and try to move the number up. Did you attempt that? What was your approach with the other three?
The other three. So I guess fundamentally there was a line in the sand for us, and I'm not sure this is good advice, so I can just share what our line in the sand was. We viewed kind of serious due diligence as the line in the sand where we weren't willing to put our smaller potential merger partners through that expense. So, there's always light due diligence as you're negotiating the terms and the numbers and things like that. And there's requests for our financials and, validation of our contracts and things like this. But this is all light. When you're starting to dig into the tax compliance with every employee we've ever had, when you're going in depth on IP, and we had a very, very robust, in the end, due diligence process with Shipit. We weren't comfortable allowing multiple parties to incur that expense, just given the relative sizes of all the businesses. So we negotiated and we ensured that we got the right terms more than push the number up. That was our focus. We wanted to make sure we had the terms of the agreement ironed out more than an extra, half a multiple, whatever it is, 0.5 multiple in addition. Yeah. We really wanted to make sure we got the right terms, the right proportion of cash, the right kind of warranties and things like that secured. So that's what we focused our negotiation on. But we negotiated with all parties right up until we could see we were about to go into kind of really serious due diligence with an intent to buy. And we knew that the Shipit business and board, they're sophisticated, they are a very experienced board, would not greenlight due diligence or the expense that they were looking at in due diligence if they weren't serious about the acquisition. We ran a risk there. And if they hadn't, we didn't know that we could go back to the other parties and get the same terms again. But that was the decision we made. We also knew that it was expensive on our end to run due diligence, and running it 3 times in parallel was going to be costly.
Yeah. And were you able to negotiate put options or the rights effectively to sell the equity that you rolled at some point in the future, giving yourself some assurance that that was going to be liquid no matter what? Like, do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah. So we've got, I think, reasonable concessions on our ability to sell. I think what's in there is fair and allows some level of liquidity. We're not rushing to sell right now, but should we choose to, we've got a path that we're comfortable with.
Yeah, that makes sense. So that's great. So you're not totally at the whim of what the Shipit board decides to do or not do. There's some. Yeah.
The end value is totally dependent on them, but we trust them.
Yeah, good. Well, this has been great. I really appreciate it. Are you up for a quick lightning round before I let you go? A quick answer to a couple questions would be amazing if you're good. If you're good with that.
Yeah, I love that. Happy to.
Awesome. What was the slimiest trick an acquirer tried to play on you in the process of selling your company?
Look, we had one player, and it's not who we went with, but one player that offered me personally a really fantastic role in the new organization, but were offering something that wasn't fair for shareholders. And that was pretty gross. That was disappointing to see, and straight away we knew they were not the partner for us.
What was the biggest mistake you made personally in the process of selling your company?
I think the complexity of the legal process was far greater than I expected. Making sure that all shareholders were on board and comfortable and communicated with really effectively, that ended up being much harder than I expected. And that's probably where I spent the most additional time in the process.
What was the lowest point you reached emotionally during the process of selling your company?
That one's easy. We were trying to get the deal wrapped up by Christmas, and there was a day we realized we weren't going to make it. And Australian business shuts down for at least 3 weeks from Christmas, normally about 4. So we knew that the deal that was about to be a week away was actually a month and a half away. And it was the same time the world's markets were starting to crack a little bit. So that was a rough Christmas, but we got there.
What was the highest point you reached emotionally during the process?
It was actually fairly recently. I think the team, as much as we try to bring them on the journey, this was a hard process for them. And it was a big identity shift. And it meant a lot of things for people individually. And we had a couple people who were really, not on board. And I've, just in the last couple months had conversations with them and heard them talk about things they're excited about for, the year ahead with Shipit. And just that felt amazing. That felt great.
That's awesome. That's awesome. As you prepared to go through this process, was there anything that a resource that you turned to, again, a book? Here I'm thinking more on the mechanics of negotiation or, how to successfully do an M&A transaction. Was there anything that you turned to, a course, a speaker, anything that you can turn our listeners to that would be helpful?
I love the Getting Past No and, that series of books. So they're fantastic. But we had a fantastic lawyer who had been through this process hundreds of times. And so that's 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙊𝙁. We also had our firm, 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙊𝙁, who we'd been using for years and had also advised in the process. But between the two of them, they really steered us through the process. So finding a lawyer that has done this before, I think that's the critical piece. And that you can build trust with, that stewarded us more than anything. And then our Baskin Clark Priest, our accounting firm, the tax partner there, Kirsty, we spoke 3 times a day for 6 months, and really phenomenal work in supporting our business.
Amazing. What did you buy yourself as a trophy?
I try to stay away from trophies. But I did buy a pair of 𝑅.𝑀 boots, which...
Okay, I don't know what those are. 𝑅.𝑀 boots? What are they?
Okay. Hang on.
If you're not watching on YouTube, you should, because Brad's showing us his boots. Okay, it's fancy.
Yeah, it's an Australian...
You sell your business for $20 million, you buy yourself a pair of leather boots.
These are sturdy. They'll last forever. They'll replace. They'll resole it for you. No, I love them. So that's what I went out and bought. Trying to play it cool for now.
Awesome. I'd be remiss to not let you go before I asked you, before we hit record. You said in the beginning, when we ran the business, there were always things that we looked at, KPIs and arguments we'd had that we thought were going to be really important. And then when we actually got into negotiation, it really just came down to a couple things. What was the difference between what you thought was important and what was actually important when it came to the sale of your company?
Yeah, no one in the sales process talks about the color of the logo. No one in the process talks about what the right snacks in the in the snack drawer are. And you know, I think there is a tremendous amount of work you can spend on trying to optimize bits of the business because you live in it that do not mean anything to someone looking to acquire. Now, a happy team and an engaged team, and we had an employee NPS score above 70, that mattered. And so anything we did that boosted that mattered. But the little things and the particulars of how a travel policy worked and things like that, which you can spend a lot of time on, they don't matter in a sale. The numbers matter, and your happy customers, your happy staff matter. That's what you should spend your time on, and that was my learning. I think we did enough of it, but there were a lot of things that felt silly in hindsight when we actually put the due diligence sheets together and realized what wasn't being asked about in that context.
Super helpful. Brad, if people want to reach out to you on social media or you're a LinkedIn guy, what's the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm Brad Lorge on LinkedIn, and I'm brad@lorge.com.au, and reach out. I'd love to hear from anyone, especially if you've got a not-for-profit that could benefit from Premonition system. I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Finish off where we started this whole conversation. We'll put all of Brad's contact information in the show notes. Then you can find that at built2sell.com. Brad, thank you for doing this.
Hey, John, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.